Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Saran Yitbarak, and I'm part of the Friday-Saturday Executive MBA program here at Columbia Business School, class of 2021. We are continuing our series called From Campus to Community, a conversation series on Blackness, anti-racism, and equality, and it's presented by the Black Executive MBA students at Columbia. So today we have two wonderful guests with us. We've got Huwe Burton, who was wrongly accused of murder in 1991 and served 19 years in prison. And we have Hilary Shelton, civil rights leader and senior vice president at the NAACP. Now, before we get to the interviews, I want to share a little bit about our organization and how we got started. And to do that, I want to introduce the woman who started this whole thing, Andrea Masson. Andrea?
Hi everyone, I'm Andrea and I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself, this group, and how it all came to be. Growing up in Jamaica, I never experienced racism. Instead, I experienced classism and colorism. My first experience with racism was when I moved to the US. I was surprised by the way that Black people were treated in America. I always wanted to help make a change, but was not sure how, nor did I feel that I had the resources to do so. As God would have it, Columbia provided me with all of this. The opportunity arose in a course called Personal Leadership and Success, led by Professor Hintedra. In this class, I had a conversation with fellow classmate John Paluska, who is a former Green Beret and Purple Heart recipient, about how he wanted to help the Black community as a white man, but wasn't sure how. You will hear from John in a later segment on August 11th. Be sure to tune in then. So I started thinking about how we can find ways to educate, activate, and encourage anti-racism by people like John who wanted to make a difference. And just like that, the idea for this initiative was born. So I brought this idea to my fellow Black classmates and they immediately jumped on board and the Black EMBA group was formed. This educational series is the first of our initiatives designed to show the issues affecting the Black community. We plan to have other events, initiatives, and campaigns to promote justice, equality, and anti-racism. We thank you for your support tonight, and we also hope you will support our upcoming sessions and future endeavors. Thank you, and I now hand back over to you, Saran.
Okay, there we go. Thank you so much, Andrea. So we're going to cover a lot this evening. We're going to have powerful conversations with Huwe and Hilary. We're going to share a bit of history through some really impactful videos that we found. And we'll talk about police reform, mass incarceration, the development of Black communities, and the role of business leaders and corporations in the fight for justice, equality, and anti-racism. And we're also going to take questions directly from you. So pay attention and get those questions ready. Now, to set the context for our interview with Huwe Burton, we're going to kick things off with a short video on mass incarceration. I'm going to share my screen with you now, and we'll take a look.
We're no longer incarcerating the individual, but we're incarcerating whole social groups. The rate of incarceration now is about 5 times higher than it was historically. Historically, it was 100 per 100,000. Now it's about 500 per 100,000. If we look at prison, if we add jail to that, it's about 700 per 100,000. Nowhere in the world incarcerates as much as we do. We've seen extremely high rates of exposure to the criminal justice system for African American men with very low levels of schooling. So if we think about Black men who were born in the late 1970s and who are growing up through the American prison boom of the 1980s and the 1990s, the chances that they're going to serve time in state or federal prison if they dropped out of high school is about 70%. So going to prison for that group of Black men with very low levels of schooling, that's become a normal life event. And that's really only happened in the last 10 years. We're at this point now where there's about 1.2 million African American children with a parent who's incarcerated. And that's about 1 in 9. The research shows that kids who experience parental incarceration have diminished school achievement, they have behavioural problems, depressive symptoms, acting out, and there's also evidence that these kinds of negative effects associated with parental incarceration are concentrated more among boys than among girls. And there's a very real risk here that incarceration becomes an inherited trait. The underlying issue is we've chosen prison as a way to respond to that problem of crime. And there are a whole variety of ways that we could have chosen to respond to that problem of crime. We've chosen the response of the deprivation of liberty. And we've chosen the response of the deprivation of liberty for a historically aggrieved group whose liberty in the United States was never firmly established to begin with.
Now, it is really important to understand the context of systemic racism, particularly when it comes to mass incarceration, but it's truly powerful to hear from someone who actually went through the prison system. Now, before I introduce our first speaker, I want to tell you a bit about him. Huwe Burton was wrongly convicted of murdering his mother in 1991. He spent 19 years in prison and was released in 2009 on parole. After being represented by the Innocence Project, a judge ruled that his confession was coerced and vacated the conviction and cleared his name. And here to tell us his story himself is Huwe Burton. Huwe, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions, so I'll try to put everything in a good framework. So my story starts simple enough. I was a 16-year-old living in the Bronx at the time. My dad was away in Jamaica on vacation at the time visiting his mom. There was a hurricane, I believe, some months before that. So he was checking on her. My mom was just starting a 2-week vacation as a registered nurse, and it was my first day back to school after the holiday break. The morning started as normal as any other morning. She got me up, I got up, washed, ate, and got ready to leave for school. The last thing we said was that I would do much better in school this semester. We laughed about that and I left. I went to school for the whole day. I came back. I noticed that the car wasn't in the driveway, so I assumed that, well, she just started a vacation. Chances are she's out shopping. She used to love to shop. So I came in, and as I was entering into the house, I hear the phone ring. So I grabbed the phone as I come inside, and it's a girlfriend of mine at the time, and asked me, did I want to come over? So I said, sure. I put the phone down, turned right back around, and left the house. I stayed there with her until about 5:30 and came back home. I noticed the car was still gone. So I came in, I took my things off, and I'm walking towards the bedrooms in the back. So before I got to my bedroom, I looked and I seen my parents' bedroom, and I noticed that the door was kind of left open. And that was something that we didn't really do, was leave the doors open when everyone left, for whatever reason. So for whatever reason, I went into the room, and when I went into the room is where I found my mom. She had been stabbed to death. So I went to grab the phone, and when I went to grab the phone, the cord wasn't, from the base to the receiver wasn't there. They had taken the cord out, and they had bound her wrist with the cord. So I ran back out to another phone in the hall. I called police, and I ran outside to make sure that they got to the right address. They got there, and from that moment, I mean, everything is just a blur. I can just remember the sound of walkie-talkies in the back, and they're asking me questions about my whereabouts for the day. So I'm telling them I was in school, that I came back and went right back out, and then this is, I'm coming back now. They asked me if I noticed if anything was strange or anything missing. I told them, yeah, I noticed that her car it's not here. Where's her car? Where's her car? So they bring me down to the precinct. I tell them the same story again. They asked me if I had anywhere to go, where my dad was. I told them he was in Jamaica. I called him and let him know what was going on. I told him I had some godparents that lived in Mount Vernon, which wasn't too far from where we lived in the Bronx. So they brought me there. That was on the 3rd of January. On the 5th, they called my godmother and said they wanted to bring me back down to the precinct for a polygraph test. I had not slept. I couldn't keep any food down. So I didn't want to get out of the bed. But I wanted to know, what happened. So reluctantly, I got up and said, okay, I'll go. They came and got me. We went back down to the precinct. While at the precinct, I told them again my whereabouts for that day and everything that I had done. And maybe about an hour, 2 hours into that, it turned. It wasn't tell us, where you were at. It was saying they felt that they had evidence that I committed the crime, and that if I didn't tell them I committed this crime, this was going to go much harder for me. I immediately started crying. I was asking for my dad. They told me I would get a chance to talk to him, but I need to talk to them first. So this goes on for hours, and I'm telling them I didn't commit this crime. Finally, they tell me, well, we know that you were at your girlfriend's house, but your girlfriend, she's younger than you were, so you don't know what that is. That's what that's called. It's called statutory rape. If you don't tell us that you committed this crime, not only are we going to put you in prison for the murder, but we're going to put you in prison for statutory rape as well.
Wow.
But if you do, we'll make sure that you will only go to family court, and your dad can come and pick you up, because they know I have been asking for my father, crying, asking for him for hours. So this went on for hours, and finally, after a while, they convinced me that it would be in my best interest that if I just signed this confession, because they knew it was an accident, and the way that they would say this, it would be an accident. I would be able to be picked up by my dad. At 16, never being in contact with any law enforcement, not knowing anything, I really felt like I couldn't go anywhere. And if I didn't tell them what they wanted to hear, I wouldn't be allowed to leave the precinct. So finally, in the wee hours of the morning, they finally get me to do this coerced confession, full of false facts and things like that. They arrest me, they give me a perp walk, they alert all of the news media throughout the city. Some days later, they finally get a hit on the missing car. They found the car in possession of our neighbor, who we had rented the apartment to about a month and a half prior. So now they had a problem. They had a coerced confession from a 16-year-old, but they had someone who they questioned on January 3rd, but we are now at January 12th, and you find him in my mom's car. You have a problem. So what they did, instead of just saying, okay, wow, we made a mistake, they doubled down on what they did, and they kind of put this guy into what the confession that they fabricated. They involved him in it, but not so much to say that you are an accomplice. And his testimony was allowed to stand. And again, like I said, they doubled down on it to make sure that it would never come to light that they coerced a 16-year-old child into confessing to something so heinous as killing his mom. My dad and I, we fought for 2.5 years, and then finally in 1991, I lost trial. I was sentenced to 15 to life. The appeals began immediately. We couldn't get any traction with any appeals. The attorney that I had at the time, he finally passed, and the trail went cold. So I began to write everybody that I could, just to say, listen, please just take a look at this case. That that there are a lot of things that are just wrong. Please take a look at it. But as the years would go on, the evidence would become more and more scattered. My dad, who was the strongest advocate that I had, he's getting on in years. And there was only but so much that he can do. Finally, he moved back to Jamaica in 2000. He had to come back up because of health reasons in 2003. And finally, he passed in 2005. So there was really nobody but me, continuing to fight. So I'm just writing. And, in 2008, finally someone took an interest and said, well, tell me more. And from 2008, I got out. 2009, I was paroled after multiple attempts. And that set off a 10-year fight to try to piece together the last 20 some odd years. And we were successful. Finally, we got up to 2016. We couldn't go any further, and we brought the Innocence Project back in, and they just really just got the ball really, really rolling. But for what they knew, less than 2 weeks after it happened, it took us 30 years to put back together. And I think therein is where the true crime happened. So, you know, finally in 2019, January, they exonerated me. So again, what we knew a few days after the fact, they tried to suppress, but it finally made the light of day. And I'm here, you know, so
Wow.
That's pretty much the last 30 years in a nutshell.
That is a truly heartbreaking story, but I am very happy to hear that you are out now, and we feel deeply honored that you are, you know, willing to share your story and just be so open with what's been going on with the last 30 years of your life. Thank you again so much for being here. What was it like in 1991 to hear that final verdict?
I actually collapsed
Wow.
in court. I remember my dad, it was family there, and we just knew that the jury that we had, it was a, you know, mixed jury in age and ethnicity. We just knew that you guys have heard the facts, and there's no way you're going to sentence me to, you know, X amount of years in life in prison. No, they came back and said guilty. I do remember my knees buckling and just me saying, you know, I didn't do this. So they remanded me because my dad had bailed me out some months before that. They managed to let him put the house up. So I was out on bail at the time in which I lost trial. So they immediately remanded me right back to Rikers Island. And, you know, we appealed some things. We put in a few motions. I stayed on Rikers Island, I guess an extra 6 months. And that brought it up to 1991 when I was eventually sentenced.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I think that for a lot of us who've never really engaged with law enforcement, who've never been charged with anything, been arrested, I think that most of us have a belief that the truth will set us free, that, you know, as long as we're honest and we're open, you know, people will do right by us. Mm-hmm. In your experience with the police and being interrogated in the prison system, at what point did that change for you? At what point did you maybe stop believing that?
I stopped believing a lot of things. Remember, when I was 16, they're telling me, even as they're giving me this perp walk and I'm seeing cameras flashing and reporters are screaming, asking me, why did you kill your mother? I'm still in my head, still believing that this was the best thing. I know I didn't do this. This will get cleared up, but in order to get past this is what they wanted from me. And being naive still, I'm still getting into the car to go down to Central Booking. I'm still believing this. It wasn't until I got almost downtown to 161st Street in the Bronx, and they had on 1010 Wins. And the same story that they fabricated and had me sign, and like, you know, they fed me pieces of the story, and we're just writing and piecing it together. The same thing I know that we spent hours piecing together, I'm listening to this reporter say it verbatim. And I said, this is not good. And I think it was at that point that my trust in law enforcement and a lot of things like that, it began to really, really shift. And it really forced me to take a look at a lot of things, and going through everything that I went through. You can imagine, you're sitting in prison 20 years and you're watching 20 years of things like a reel just going on in front of you with regards to law enforcement and things like that. And it's like, it really changes you. It shifts your views, and it shifts your dynamic towards all of it.
Mm-hmm. So for those of us who've, again, never been a part of law enforcement, never engaged, and definitely haven't been interrogated, I think it's really hard for us to imagine confessing to a crime that we didn't commit. I think it's really easy for us to say, well, of course I didn't do it. Why would I say that I did? And clearly you were interrogated very, very aggressively. What was the breaking point for you? What was the moment where you said, I have no choice, I need to do what they say?
Well, you know, you have to. It's important to remember that I did not know whether I was coming or going. At the time they had me in there interrogating me, I still have the image as clear as day of what I just walked in and saw. Um, I've never been, questioned by police. None of the, all of these things are foreign to me. Like in my mind, it's like I just went to school, this morning, and then you come back and then everything is kind of upside down, and you just want it to stop. And they provided, or what I thought was the only way to make it stop. So um, being in there when they got me to that point, they had really like broken me. I did not know where I was coming and going. They could have told me to say that I committed any crime. I would have probably told them, yeah, just to get out of that room and just to not feel what I felt inside there. Taking into account, I'm not even getting a chance to properly grieve. So all of these things are happening simultaneously. So when you factor all those things and you factor in my age, that kind of made it easy for them to get me to do whatever it was they wanted me to.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you, and this is, a little bit of speculation, but do you believe that there was a time when they genuinely believed that you did it, or do you feel like they knew it was coerced the entire time?
They knew, I believe they knew it was coerced the entire time. How I became a suspect, what I had learned many years later, is that when they did go to my school and asked my homeroom teacher, was I in school that day? She initially went to where she was, marking students in or out. Initially, she looked at where my name was and didn't have me checked in. So I think for them, that became the shift for them. And I guess, well, let's get him back down to the precinct. Because if he's lying about being in school, what else is he lying about? So on one hand, I can understand that. Again, where the crime happens is when this same teacher contacts those officers and said, I made a great mistake. No, 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 no. He was here, and puts it in writing that, no, he was here at that time. And you decide to say, well, they don't need to see that. That's the crime, So I became, a suspect at that point. But I believe that when they started trying to feed me facts of the case, things that they looked at assessing a crime scene, and they say, okay, well, chances are this happened. So in feeding me that, I know that as seasoned veterans, they knew, wait a minute, this is, no. This is not adding up. They didn't just become detectives last year. Like, okay, this isn't adding up. So I think they knew by the time they got the confession, like, this really doesn't make sense, but it's his own words. He signed it. He did a videotape confession. It's 1989. It's gonna stick. And that was the gamble that they took.
It certainly seemed like it was the easiest thing to do. It was just to convict you, move on, and move on to the next case. And it's unfortunate that they took that approach.
Right. Sorry. Go ahead. Ask your question.
No, go for it. Go for it.
So what I was saying was, in 1989, it's important to know that there was any type of cases like that. There's always a rush to close them as fast as you can, regardless if it was sloppy police work or dirty police work or whatever it was. There was just a rush to close these cases, and mine was no different.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about all that's been happening currently with Black Lives Matter. And I'm wondering, do you think things would have been different for you had this movement happened back in 1991?
I think with how we are making people take notice of things, I don't think if this was going on then that what they did to me would have been allowed to happen that easy, especially with someone like my father, who was always an advocate wherever he could say, listen, my son is innocent. So I think if we would have had things like that in place then, yeah, it would have been a very different narrative.
Absolutely. So one of the things that have happened as a result of the fight towards anti-racism is that people have been really paying attention to symbols and pulling down Confederate flags and Confederate statues. I heard that in one area they were not calling it the master bedroom anymore, just the bedroom.
Okay.
Which I thought was interesting. There's the murals that are being painted. So I'm wondering, when it comes to symbolism, what do you think? Where does that stand in our fight?
Well, the taking down of statues that represent our enslavement, our continued, just being pushed to the bottom. The taking down of those symbols, I cannot be mad at that. However, I cannot say that the buck is supposed to stop there. I don't know what it's, things are supposed to change after that. You pull down the symbol, or we do things, we paint in the street. It's like, okay, this is great. Now what? What is the end result? Does this give us any power? Does this give us any leverage in educating our children in our schools? Does Does this give us economic freedom? If the things in which we do don't lead to those results, then I'm not sure what it is that we're doing it for.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes complete sense. So one of the big conversations has been defunding the police versus police reform. As someone who's been through the prison system and been a part of the crimes that have been committed against you, I'm wondering, how do you feel about that argument? Are you for defunding, for police reform? Where do you stand on that?
I've, for the last, looking at the news, I always tell myself I shouldn't, but, for the last month or so, looking at the news, I'm hearing this cry to defund the police. No one is really being clear on what defunding the police actually looks like. You saying, okay, you're going to take money that they would normally get for what? Okay, is that money normally that would have went to overtime? What does defunding the police look like? So it's kind of hard for me to give an answer to that because I don't know the language in which they're using. A lot of times it's not my interpretation. It's those who hold power. How are they using the language? And I don't know what defunding the police means or what it looks like for them.
That's fair. And I think that from the conversations I've seen in the articles I've read, it sounds like the bigger picture with defunding the police is taking the resources that we would, use to put police in schools, put police in the streets, and instead using them for, fighting homelessness, for fighting drug addiction, for social services, and those types of help. Because oftentimes the police are called in situations that, a social worker would be much better suited to solve. Our police system feels like kind of the de facto go-to for every situation where there might be a possible conflict, where different organizations, different professionals might be better trained. So do you feel like we're kind of using the police too much, or do you feel like even with your experience, we still need the resources that we have?
I believe that you're right as far as using social workers that could quell different disputes and things like that that you don't have to call the police for. But what's very great about what you said is, yeah, we don't need it, but okay, are we willing to police ourselves? That's where things start getting a little dicey. Are you willing to police yourself? I've worked, and I think we were having this discussion before, I've worked in communities where, in New York City, where looks like they don't have a separate thing going on, but you can tell that they are taking care of the business of themselves. They are policing themselves. So we have to ask ourselves, okay, well, we don't want to see police like that or for whatever. Are you willing to toe the line and police yourself?
Yeah. So, I think that's fair. Yeah, that makes sense. Either way, someone has to do the policing, whether it's the police or whether it's, our own community. So yeah, I think that's a good thing to point out, is we have to figure out what are the other solutions and how do we keep each other safe. What are your thoughts on police reform?
Interesting. I think when you talk about police reform, You're talking about not just in training, you're talking about in mindset. And I don't know if it's possible to change a certain mindset. It's the very fabric of who and what they are. I'm not sure if that is going to change.
How would you describe who and what they are?
Great question. Police, when we look at them, when we look at other neighborhoods, we may look at people from those neighborhoods, like we were talking about policing themselves. The neighborhoods in which we come from are the place that people come from outside to kind of police you and keep order. Nowhere else does that really happen. So I'm pretty much looking at it that way.
Yeah, that makes sense. The conversations around reform I've seen, a big part of those conversations are around training and retraining. Bias training has been one that's come up. Making sure that people know how to de-escalate versus going, using their weapons first. When it comes to initiatives like this, do they bring you hope? Do you feel like that would make a difference, or do you feel like the problem is just really too deep for reform?
I think it is. I think it's a little bit too deep for that. When you come to a place already with a predisposition about a people, your training or lack thereof is not going to matter. You come already with a mindset about a people. It really doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm. So mass incarceration is one of the many forms of systemic racism. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people who just don't believe in systemic racism. And there are people who say racism is in the past. It's already happened. We've already had the civil rights. We've already we've done the work and really we're fine, which is interesting. So I'm wondering, as someone who has been affected by systemic racism, what do you say to those people who just don't understand?
I believe that the things that are in place are things that have been going on with Black people for a very, very, very long time. And the pictures have changed, but the narrative, it still remains the same. Whereas if I'm going to go get a loan for a mortgage, for instance, and a white person is going to get a loan for a mortgage immediately because of our ethnicity, they're going to look for ways not to give me the mortgage, as opposed to look for ways to give them the mortgage. These things, for people to say that they don't see it, it's because people don't want to see it. Because it forces them to really take a look at their life and say, what part in this do I play? Even in their silence, it is a part that they're playing, and they would much rather put the blame on us and say, well, it's because you're not pulling yourselves up by your bootstrap. It's easier to do that than it is to assume the responsibility that, wow, we're all responsible for what has happened here, and we still continue to see it, but most of us benefit from it, so we're just not going to say anything. It doesn't exist. And I think that that's almost worse. The people who know and say nothing, as opposed to those who are just acting in ignorance. So.
Absolutely. So I'm wondering how you feel about the individual role in systemic racism, because when we talk about systemic racism, usually we're talking about systems, right? We're talking about laws and reform and policy and common practices that have been around for many, many years, that have been passed down and have these incredible long-lasting effects on a certain community. And it's hard to, just as an individual, as one person, to look at that and go, well, what am I supposed to do? I didn't make those laws. I'm not the one discriminating against people getting loans, so when you think about just you as an individual, you as a person, what is our place in the fight against systemic racism?
And let me make sure I know your question. Just ask me again. Just so.
Sure, no problem. So as individuals who are interested in bringing down systemic racism, what can we possibly do?
Interesting. Part of dismantling it is a part of one of the places that people just don't want to look, and it's in your prisons. Some of the most talented, some of the most misguided, some of the most misunderstood, some of the hardest working are right there. Those are the ones, if you want to rebuild anything, that's where you should start from. I can remember 20 years ago being inside there, and the theme and order of the day was make sure that no violent felons are ever released. And the sentiment was echoed by many people out here. And people were going to parole boards and they were just being denied. I mean, guys were coming with degrees, guys were coming wanting to actually start to repay their debt to society after they got out, guys wanting to do great things, and they were denied parole. And now you fast forward, now the theme is reform, prison reform. It's just, it's 20 years removed. When that is no longer the theme of the day, when the curtain close on that, what can we do? Make sure that we continue that fight, because long after it's no longer headlines, there's still going to be people wrongfully accused. There's still going to be people in and out of prison, being sent in through parole for silliness, jamming up the system. These things are still going to go on long after we've left the streets. So, that's where we need to start at. Make sure that we keep the fight up, man, long after they say you don't have to do that anymore.
One of the organizations that are definitely tackling systemic racism and mass incarceration is the organization that helped you, that got you free, the Innocence Project. Can you tell us a little bit about that organization?
Great organization. It started out when I was writing to them. They initially told me that I didn't have any issues of DNA with my case, which was back in like 2004, somewhere thereabout. When they forwarded my case to Northwestern, and we eventually had to bring them back, and they began representing me with these different law clinics, I really got a chance to see exactly what it is that they do, the amount of guys that they represented and freed. The amount of guys who I was with that I never knew the circumstances of their cases. We never discussed them, but we're meeting at Innocence Project offices. Very great organization that is committed to, righting the wrongs of our justice system. So I have nothing but praise for them and everything.
How did you get connected with them?
Well, I was writing after my dad passed in 2005. I was writing everybody that I could. Innocence Project was the name that you would hear the most. But again, as I said, someone from intake did write me back and said, look, I know about your case, but you don't have any issues of DNA. Again, they forwarded my information to Northwestern. Northwestern brought in Rutgers Law Clinic in Newark. And they did as much as they could up until 2016. And they said, look, we need to bring the Innocence Project back in. So that's how that started as the official relationship. So.
So I imagine the Innocence Project must be inundated with different letters and people who, who are innocent, who want help and support. Why do you think they picked you?
I think when you sit and you look at the circumstances of this case, when you look at what they did, when you look at the sacrifices my dad made to make sure that I was provided the best defense that I could possibly get, you're hard pressed to look at that and to be able to do something about it and not do anything. So yes, you get a lot of cases, but you don't really get someone who, after finishing 20 years, 8 months, is still saying, I'm not finished. This case is not over. You just made me do 21 years. It's not over. So I think when people see that kind of passion and determination, it makes them say, look, there's something here. I'm glad that they got on board.
Absolutely. One of the things that I find incredible and absolutely inspiring about your story is the fact that you never gave up. I mean, 19 years is an incredibly, you could raise a child in 19 years. That's a very long time. And so I'm wondering what made you hopeful? Why didn't you give up? Why didn't you stop writing? What made you keep going?
Truth. And it's funny, you know, and even when I say it now, it's like, even sometimes it's like, wow, it sounds corny coming out, but even when you know that you have truth, and it's like, this is insane. This is going to get corrected somehow, some way. And, you know, years are going on and you're still saying, I know this is going to get corrected. That, and watching the sacrifices of my father, the things he did to make sure that I was safe, to make sure that I was okay, all the while trying to hold on to his own sanity and deal with everything that he had to go through. It was very interesting. It was humbling to see.
Mm-hmm.
So things really kept me balanced and kept me going.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I want to talk about what happened after prison once you were released. And I know that one of the other huge conversations around prison reform is reentry, and how reentry is incredibly difficult. People who are formerly incarcerated have an incredibly difficult time finding work and really, starting their lives over again. What was reentry like for you?
To be honest, it wasn't as hard as a lot of friends of mine, and a lot of other people in which I know. Thankfully, when I came out, as soon as I came out, there were offers for, you know, employment. Not doing too much because I didn't really have any any skills that I could really use. They don't teach you a lot of skills that you can use when you get back, but people were willing to hire me because of a family or a friend or whomever. So I didn't have that. So I kind of came in and got right into employment for a few dollars. A lot of guys who do come out, the stigma of being in prison or being on parole, that's almost like two strikes against you already. And, you know, if you don't have the skills that they're looking for, you're definitely out of the door. So it's hard. It's hard for a reentry, but again, for me, it wasn't that hard. One of the things that I didn't understand was that when I came home, it was September 1st, 2009. We were in the height of the recession. So anybody who promised me anything, it was like everybody had to hold on to their purse string because no one had ever seen anything like that before. So, the future was uncertain, and then here it is. Here I come after 20 years, and I'm clueless. So that was the hardest adjustment. But in terms of reentry, I didn't have a lot of the problems that a lot of my friends and others had.
What was your first job? Do you remember?
My first job was actually working for my cousin. It was so funny. He's a business owner, motivational speaker, and he's like, "Look, I need some help. I need you to, videotape me." I said, "I don't know how to work a video recorder, and I don't tape." He says, "Look, don't worry about anything. Wherever I move, just follow me with the with the camera. We'll worry about the editing later." I found that I actually enjoyed it, and I started just doing videotaping for him. So I went from that. I worked in medical waste. Driving a forklift. I worked 8 years as an elevator mechanic, and that I did that right up until the exoneration in last January.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I imagine that, first day finally being able to come home in 2009 must have been, a powerful moment for you. What did you do that day? Do you remember?
You know something? I think I just went inside and I didn't do anything. I don't know if it was fear of just, walking around in the street after being away so long, or just wanting to have a quiet moment, because you kind of know that after today, there's no more quiet moments. So I didn't do anything exciting. I just went home and just stayed inside for that first day.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I want to get back to systemic racism. When you and I were talking earlier this week, you said something that was really profound, that really struck me. You talked about how one of the big issues of systemic racism is this distinction between Black neighborhoods and Black communities. And so I wanted to kind of hear your perspective on that. What is the difference between a Black neighborhood and a Black community?
Great. So what I was saying about that, working in construction, it afforded me to work in neighborhoods that I would have not have normally gone into. And one of the neighborhoods that I went into that I thought was great was over by Kings Highway. It's an area, it's like predominantly a Jewish area in Brooklyn. And working out there, I was out there for maybe about a year. And just watching how the people moved. They had ambulance services, all of the stores were people who lived in the neighborhood, and everyone seemed to know everybody, and everyone also seemed to know that we were just there to work. We weren't supposed to be there. You felt that as well. What I noticed is that when I would come back to a lot of the places where we live, I would notice that everyone else is doing business there who does not look like you. The ambulance services that come around, it's like if they get to you, they get to you. It's like things are not done here the way it's done there. And I said, those are communities. What we have are neighborhoods. There are a lot of us who live together, and everybody's trying to figure something out. Everybody's trying to get out. If you ever notice, they don't try to get out of their neighborhoods. They're saying they don't want nobody in. That's the difference, So our things is just where we just reside, and everybody's trying to get out and just trying to survive and figure things out. People from other places are encouraged to come there and open up businesses. One of the things that I've noticed that is very interesting is that in certain neighborhoods, you won't see necessarily, you may not see a Chinese restaurant in certain Jewish neighborhoods. It's just not going to be there. You're not going to see a soul food restaurant in a Polish neighborhood. You're just not going to see it. But everyone else can come and open business where you're from. So, again, very interesting. So that's the difference between neighborhoods and communities.
What is the power of having a Black community? Why is that important?
A voice. All of these neighborhoods, they have people that are in government who they say you're representing our interests. We don't have anyone who truly represents our interests because no one really wants to address what they are, because that runs very deep. They use Black people to kind of just kind of talk to us, placate us with a lot of things. And then when it's time to say, okay, well, what are you going to give us? It's never to give you anything. So it's very weird. It's very weird.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So when I think about Black communities, one thing that comes to mind is Black businesses. And one of the things that's come out of the Black Lives Matter movement and the conversations we're having around anti-racism today is this investment in Black-owned businesses. And I've seen many calls to action to surface Black-owned businesses, to promote them, to lift them up. I've seen grant programs. One of the ones that comes to mind is the makeup company Glossier, where they dedicated $500,000 to provide grants and to provide opportunities for Black-owned makeup and to provide those opportunities. Another really great initiative that I saw is by Elaine Weltoth, who was former editor-in-chief of Teen Vogue. And she has a campaign where she's encouraging retailers to dedicate at least 15% of shelf space to Black-owned businesses, because Black people represent 15% of the United States, which I thought was, and I know she has some pretty big retailers on board. It's a really inspiring initiative. And so I'm wondering, when you think about Black communities and Black businesses, what is the relationship between those two? How can we use Black businesses and the force that they have to build up these Black communities?
You can use the Black businesses to grow a Black dollar. And what I mean by that, I've seen different other neighborhoods. I think we discussed that too early this week, that, some neighborhoods, their dollar goes around about 18 times before it leaves. Other neighborhoods, 8 to 10 times. Others, 5 times. In Black neighborhoods, that dollar goes around about a day.
Wow.
It's gone. So there is no power there. Who wants to advocate for you? Who needs to advocate for you? So with regards to Black business, I think that is great. I've been seeing a lot come up on my timeline about different Black-owned businesses, and I've been trying to go to them, and whatever change I can get together to give, I do, in hopes that we continue to keep circulating that dollar. That's the only way that you're going to have a voice. As long as your money is not spent among you to create that voice, you're always going to be at the mercy of somebody else.
Absolutely. And I think one of the great things about thinking about Black-owned businesses is it's something we as individuals can do, right? We can support a Black-owned business. We can spend our dollars in the Black communities and in the businesses. So yeah, I think that is really powerful. So thank you so much, Huwe, for being here. Thank you so much for sharing your story and for going into just the really powerful, really unfortunate details of what happened to you over the last 30 years. We're incredibly honored. So one of the important things that we touched on just now is the role of Black neighborhoods in the fight for equality, justice, and racism. So now we're going to take questions from the audience. So please use the raise hand tool and we will, I'll call on you and you can ask your questions to Huwe. So we'll take a moment, give you some time to think about your questions, and then we'll call on you. All right, I see Irma Rivera. Irma, go ahead. Irma, can you hear us? I believe you've been unmuted.
Sorry, I just wanted to say real quick that to find the hand raises in the lower right-hand corner, it took me a second to find it myself. I found the very interesting comment about the neighborhoods. And what I found interesting about it, when you were talking about communities and also talking about the neighborhoods, one of the things that you had said was that you're just looking to kind of get out of it. And so I guess my question is there a way that we can make it, besides having the support of government and everything else that we need, is there anything else that we can do within the neighborhood to make it so that we actually don't want to necessarily get out of it, but maybe try to, I mean, I sound ignorant and who I am, but I'm curious to know if there's maybe some things we can try to, wrangle to make the neighborhood more of what we're looking to get to, if that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. I think that one of the things that we need, first let me say this. We all know, we can look at the communities or neighborhoods that we're in and you can tell what it needs. What you may not know is where the money is going to come from to fix whatever problem it is going to be. But all of us know exactly what these neighborhoods need. And also, those of you, I don't know how many are like in the education field, but we have to look at the disparities in education. We have to look at that. So in doing so, we have to say, okay, well, we have to get control of our institutions, industries. How do we build this? As I was talking about in prisoners, you have a lot of guys that are languishing in prison and didn't know that they were extremely naturally talented at being plumbers, at being electricians, at being, whatever. But people were trying to force school down their throat when they were younger, and school, people's brain may not be wired for academics. Some people's brains maybe just be wired for using their hands. That's where their greatness and gifts lie. But if we don't control our education in our institutions, we'll never find that out. And we would just write them off as problems, and they become problematic, as the same thing the opening clip said, become problematic. And then, you find yourself in prison, and the cycle keeps going on and keeps going on, while not saying what you're saying, but then we're still sitting saying, what can we do? We're looking smack dead at the problem, so.
Wonderful. All right, any other questions? And if you're looking for the raise hand button, as we just heard, it's in participants, and then there's a little raise button there, there's a little hand icon there. All right, I see one from Dongle? Not sure if I said that correctly.
Hi, Huwe. Thank you so much for sharing today. So the Columbia Business School will be relocating closer to Harlem, and there'll be a lot more interactions, I think. And is there any advice you'd like to give us and what we can do better as a business community going forward?
As a business community moving forward, you guys are moving into Harlem?
We have a new campus opening in Manhattanville. So we'll be moving from being inside Columbia University campus to our own separate campus that's much closer to Harlem.
Okay. What I would like, if you can, when you guys move up to Harlem and you see a lot of the people there, a lot of Black people who definitely need the benefit of some type of education. They may not necessarily have to be in an institution, man, but teach people how to be self-sufficient, however you can. Find creative things to do. I see people all in the city find creative things to do with their block all the time. So, I mean, there are so many different things that you can do, but educate the people around you. The people who need it the most are the people who you see walking up and down the street who they're trying to push out of there, to make room for, expansion, development. So teach the people that are there.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. If you have it, please raise your hand. Jeff Pope?
Yes, thank you. Huwe, I appreciate you sharing this with us. I'm an EMBA. I graduated in 2017 from the Columbia program. I was part of a group that built a curriculum, an entrepreneurship curriculum for the REAP program that I believe is being taught in several facilities in the New York area. And I was just curious as you try to adjust to, I guess, life on the outside, what do you see the biggest hurdles long term? I think some of the experiences I had with some of the formerly incarcerated individuals, they talked about how it actually wasn't that hard to adjust once they got out, but that once they got into years 3, 4, 5, and beyond that, it became a real challenge. Just what do you perceive as the biggest hurdles as you continue to try to thrive on the outside?
Yeah, something, those fellas that told you that, talking about years 3, 4, and 5, they're very, very true, man. Those are some of the roughest years. Those are the years that are going to make you or break you. Those are the years that you're going to find out whether or not you're doing something that's going to send you back to prison, or you're just not cutting it for whatever reason. Those years are very hard. A lot of people who welcomed you home, now they're expecting you to perform, and you're supposed to be able to do something at this point. You've been out here 3 years, so that's one of the biggest hurdles. I think for me, I can only speak for long-termers. It's really hard, especially when you go in as a teenager, because you go in at 16, 17, 18 years old, and many of us come back out in our late 30s, early 40s. You're expected to conduct yourself as a 40-year-old who has had all of these years of experience. And a lot of times it really doesn't work like that. In a lot of us find ourselves in trouble, whether it's failed relationships or whatever, but a lot of different things in adult life kind of, they really don't work right because that long time that we were in there. So, you know, the adjustment, again, as the gentleman told you, it's really not hard, but there are going to be a lot of tests, and that's going to determine how you're going to swim when you're out here.
And next we have Amir Chambers. Let's do one more. Go ahead, Amir. Let me go ahead and unmute you. All right, go ahead, Amir.
Hi, hello. We actually haven't had a chance to meet, but you're actually my mom's cousin, Regina. I'm her son, Amir.
Oh, wow.
So I know that when you came out, my cousin Andrew happened to be there for you as a support system. And so I guess my question is, within the Black community, do you think that there should be programs to help Black men and women coming out of the prison system to help them thrive coming out and just kind of helping them rehabilitate themselves back into reality?
Absolutely. The only thing is, I think that the programs need to happen before we get out, because by the time you get out, again, everything is moving. I was blessed and fortunate to come back to a family who kind of have things balanced and together. You know, everybody doesn't come back to that kind of a setting. So it's important to provide those necessary skills while they're there before they come out, so they know what they're getting into and they know how to move. Like, for instance, they would have social services when a guy is getting ready to go to the parole board. So you're supposed to be doing these things to prepare you for your first few months when you get out. The problem with it is some of the guys that are teaching this class have been in prison 24 years. I don't know what you can tell me about my first 6 months in the street. You've been here longer than I have. So we need people who know what is going on in real time to go in and teach that stuff before guys get out, so they know exactly what they're walking into.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Hugh. Again, very honored to have you here. Thank you for spending your evening with us. We really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you guys for having me. I appreciate it.
So now we're going to move to a slightly different topic, a related but slightly different topic. We're going to start the conversation with police brutality. And to kick off that conversation, I'm going to show you another short video, a truly, truly impactful one that puts numbers behind that conversation. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and we shall take a look.
The death of 22-year-old Stephon Clark sparked nationwide protests.
Clark was hit 20 times. He was in his grandparents' backyard at the time.
This is what we have to do to not only this young man, but those who are going to come behind him.
Federal police officers will not face charges saying they did not break any laws when they shot Stephon Clark in his grandparents' backyard.
And the same cop who killed him is back on the streets patrolling other communities, running through other people's backyards. I'm uneasy with that.
Anger overnight over the shooting death of 26-year-old Botham Jean in his own apartment.
Former Dallas police officer Amber Geiger is waking up this morning behind bars. She was found guilty yesterday of murdering her neighbor in his own home.
Tatiana is her name, and everyone is seeing that name on social media. There she is.
She was up playing video games with her nephew when she was shot and killed by former Fort Worth police officer Aaron Dean.
The Fort Worth police officer who shot at Tatiana Jefferson in her own home has been formally charged with murder.
All right, and with that very incredible, very powerful video, we're going to bring on Hilary Shelton, who's going to talk to us about these issues and other issues as well. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a bio about Mr. Shelton. It's a very, very impressive bio. So Hilary O. Shelton is the Senior Vice President of Advocacy, of Policy and Advocacy, Director of the NAACP Washington Bureau. His government affairs portfolio includes many, many crucial issues such as affirmative action, equal employment protection, access to quality education, stopping gun violence, ending racial profiling, abolition of the death penalty, access to comprehensive health care, voting rights protection, federal sentencing and prison reform, and a host of civil and human rights enforcement, expansion, and protection issues. So he has a very full resume, and he was also very instrumental in the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1991. So Hilary, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, sister, it's an honor to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So building off of that, absolutely impactful video that we just watched on police brutality, I want to talk about the role of video recordings. So before these videos became public, specifically in the George Floyd case, police were claiming that he was resisting arrest. And of course, we saw on video that that was absolutely not the case, but it makes us think about all the many deaths we've seen, the thousands of cases we just heard about, where there was no video recording and there is no evidence. And so I'm wondering, when it comes to proving that these lives have been needlessly gone, I'm wondering, what can these families do, these families that need that justice? What possible reform could we do to remedy these false reports?
Well, let's begin with video recording itself. If we look back historically, we know that video recording really broke through the wall of the differences between sides of town. If you think about it for a minute, when you think about misbehavior of police officers, on one side of the town, the side of the town that we live on, we look at some of the same police officers and we see somebody who is part of an occupying force. If you go to the other side of town, what you see is someone who's officer friendly. So in essence, it's been very difficult up until, I would say, the Rodney King incident, for people on the other side that have known that police officer to actually provide service and protection, that same police officer could actually try to beat somebody to death, as on the Rodney King case. But it took a white man standing on the balcony of his apartment, playing with a new toy at the time. We're also talking about the early 1990s. That toy was a 8mm video camera. And what he ended up filming while he was playing with his new toy is Rodney King being basically almost beaten to death, with a number of bones broken, lacerations, and everything that's dangerous along those lines. So as we think about video itself, it has been a crucial tool. As we look at the kind of evidence of the increase of people participating in demonstrations, the outrage of Americans of all races, colors, and ethnicities, an organizational lead of something called Black Lives Matter is as diverse or more diverse than anything we've ever seen before. In essence, as we're thinking about that, the video tool is extremely important. And as you mentioned, sometimes we'll see police officers lying, out lying about what just happened. I'm thinking very much about what happened with George Floyd. If you look at the report that he filed and you look at the video that was captured on his video camera, you see two very different stories. So to move from that point to the videos are very, very important. They've proven to be more effective than ever before. We're seeing the advent of this impact utilizing social media. Let me switch gears. As we think about the families themselves and responding to that part of the question, I would say that the families need to first focus on making sure justice is served in their particular case. File the lawsuit. Utilize that power and actually begin building the support that we've seen in Floyd's case and otherwise, of people knowing exactly what happened, that people get copies of the video. You've seen much of that has changed their minds. The family needs to be willing to talk about it, but focus on what they've experienced as well. And we have to be there to provide as much support as we possibly can along those lines as well. Stage two, I want them to talk about what happened. As we know, when we look at how we're addressing the problems in our communities and across our world for that matter, we look at data. We have the saying in the NAACP, in order to manage the problem, you have to first measure it. That data is very, very important as we're looking and understanding how extraordinary the problem is and the depth and breadth of that problem. It also means that we know as human beings think about these issues, what really makes a difference is how we feel. Looking at raw data is one thing for us social scientist types and whatnot. I mean, I'm a policy wonk. I love looking at the data, and that's the first questions I'm going to ask along those lines. And you guys are actually all in colleges and universities, are preparing for colleges and universities across the country to sharpen your skills to be able to pursue whatever it is you want to do with your lives. We want to make sure we have that data, but we also have to tell that story. The anecdotes are crucial. When we look at what happened to George Floyd, what really hits us is exactly how it happened. Seeing that video or somebody being able to tell that story, hearing from a parent, a sibling, a child of that person, and just what it all means, how we humanize the victims of these cases too. We know one of the experiences we have often across the country, quite frankly, Michael Brown is a very good example of this. And this is where the wonkishness comes out as well. If you listen to or read the transcripts from the grand jury hearing of officer, the officer that killed Michael Brown, his name just slipped my mind that quickly. He ended up spending time with a grand jury, and we know how grand juries can be convoluted by overwhelming them with information. And then, as we saw in Michael Brown's case, saying somehow they're going to be able to discern from all of that whether or not charges to be brought. Don't forget, the grand jury is actually a tool of the prosecution. It is not the courtroom that decides guilt or innocence. It's a tool of the prosecution to decide whether to bring charges or not. Being aware of all of that means that as we're thinking about these cases, we need to raise those issues in those terms as well, because here's what Wilson was his last name. I apologize for my lack for just a second. Officer Wilson said to the grand jury in a very buddy-buddy scenario, that is, the prosecuting attorney set it up so there were no specific questions for the grand jury to respond to. He threw everything, every piece of evidence he heard from any side to the grand jury and expected them to be able to rifle their way through it. I'll be totally honest with you. What he expected them to do is exactly what happened, to not come to a conclusion that charges should be brought. So Wilson was able to walk away scot-free. So all that is saying that the family needs to raise the issue. It needs to talk about it, bring the lawsuits, but include in those lawsuits not just liability on behalf of the police officers, but also changes that need to be made by the police department as well. As you know, in a settlement along these lines, you can certainly determine guilt or innocence, but you can also say part of addressing that issue is determining the changes that should be made by police departments across the country to be able to address the wrong that was done.
Exactly. And that's, one of the things I wanted to get to too, is talking about police reform. And there's this one example in Florida of a sheriff named Mike Chitwood, who went to Scotland and observed some of their police practices and training. And he was inspired by what they were doing. This is a couple of years ago. He was inspired by what they were doing. And so he introduced a new training where 40 hours of crisis intervention was required in his jurisdiction. And I thought this was incredible because there was a time when 40 hours of crisis intervention wasn't a part of the policing education. Like, that feels like, first of all, 40 hours is nothing, right? 40 hours is 1 week of work. And the idea that that wasn't already part of the curriculum, part of the training, was really baffling. I mean, thankfully it is now, but the fact that there was a time where it wasn't, to me, is baffling. And even 40 hours doesn't quite feel like enough. So I'm wondering, when you think about police reform and what role that has, what are your thoughts? Is that a solution? What should we be doing?
Well, it's part of a comprehensive solution. We have a broad and expansive problem. It's going to require a very comprehensive approach to solving it. Let me just say that that's a very helpful part of it. Like everything else, again, speaking from my wonkish point of view, we have to develop the policy. That is, here's the question. What is the acceptable use of force under the circumstances in which that person was killed? Acceptable. Let me say one of the commonalities we hear in almost every case across the country that's been outrageous as we've watched the video. How in the world can anyone not see that the police officer was wrong? How can anyone not see that that officer ought to be prosecuted and fired and that should never happen again? How could you not see that when you watch that video footage? Well, let me just say in each and every one of those cases, a spokesperson for the police department came out to speak to the press when the issue boiled to the surface. And among other things, what that person said is, number one, we are so sorry for the loss of life, and our condolences go out to the family of whoever it was that was just unnecessarily killed by a police officer. But our police officer did nothing wrong. Everything they did was by the book. Now, for those of us who are thinking about these issues, as you guys are and whatnot, the question then becomes, how could that be possible? And what should be done? And the response is, well, look, the way this stuff is written is, if there's no prohibition to using certain strategies, tactics, and approaches in these police circumstances, then a police officer acting, and they'll say, in the best interest of those who they're trying to serve and protect, should be able to get away with pretty much anything. We would argue that's not true. And what we've got to do is first set policies that of the acceptable use of force under certain circumstances. There should be no acceptable use of deadly force against somebody that's walking back to their apartment, coming from the 7-Eleven with a pack of Skittles and a can of iced tea. As you think about Michael Brown, there should be nothing that anyone would be able to use deadly force against a young man scheduled to start school the very next week, walking down the street in his community in Ferguson, Missouri, with some things he brought from the corner store as well. But indeed, in both of those circumstances, the use of deadly force was somehow acceptable, and all it took is the police officer saying, I felt threatened, as irrational as that feeling should have been. I felt threatened. Well, let me jump back again to the transcripts in the Michael Brown case. In the Michael Brown case, as the officer was sitting in front of the grand jury, what the officer said was, when I looked in his face, I saw something that didn't seem to be alive. What he said is, I saw something that seemed to be more like a shark, not a human being. What I saw in this 18-year-old was something that scared me. And as such, I pulled out my gun to protect myself. It was irrational for him to do that, but somehow it wasn't illegal. So in essence, we've got to make sure that we're thinking about the new policies. The policies have to speak to the issue of what we call racial profiling, the front end. Police officers stopping someone for no good reason, even though no crime has been reported, but somehow you look suspicious. Well, let me say, sometimes a police officer thinking someone looks suspicious is nothing but deep-seated racist ideas. In other words, ain't that the way gangbangers look? Don't they all dress that way? And in essence, as we looked at his case, I keep using Michael Brown because I was just so outraged as I read those transcripts, that that's another example of how problematic it is. So here's the issue. Number one, we have to change the paradigm. And pulling out a gun and using it must be the most extreme circumstance the police officers responding. Most extreme. So if the other person is not armed, then what about all the other tools we've given that police officer to utilize to apprehend a suspect? Let us not forget that these people, before they go before a judge and jury, or a judge at least, are just suspects. We think they might have done wrong, but we have not established anything wrong was done. Michael Brown's case, nothing wrong was done. With George Floyd's case, nothing wrong was done. If Garner was accused of selling cigarettes, that should not be punishable by death. But nonetheless, that's exactly what we end up experiencing. Let me just say the eerie feeling for me as we look at some of these cases, I'll just use the two that are so similar in so many ways, is Eric Garner and George Floyd. In both of those cases, we watched them summarily executed by police officers in a slow and painful manner. They were pleading for their lives. We have to make sure that never happens again. So let me just say this. We have some great legislation we just passed in the House. The George Floyd Police Reform Bill is one that will be very, very helpful in moving us in the right direction. It includes a comprehensive anti-racial profiling component. It includes a use of force component. It includes a mandate to de-escalate first, and the police officers have to be taught in de-escalation standards. They have to be held liable, because I know the sad thing is this, under something called the Police Officers' Bill of Rights, police officers don't even have to talk to anybody about what happened in these extraordinary circumstances. Depending on which contract they're under, that was actually negotiated by some arm of the FOP or other police unions. Let me stop there for a second. Unions don't like police unions. Have sat next to them and testified before the Congress in many cases with them. Their number one strategy, and I appreciate this part of it, until it's applied, their number one strategy is to make sure that their police officers don't get in trouble, regardless of what they do. Have to do additional work, including things like collecting data. Interesting sideline story. I ended up testifying before the U.S. House of Representatives Judiciary Committee about, 15, 20 years ago at this point. Sitting next to me was the president of the Fraternal Order of Police that happened to be a Latino brother from New Mexico by the name of Guillermo Gallegos. I would never forget him. He sat there and seemed like a nice kind of guy that would recognize racial bias and other challenges within law enforcement. But after he finished testifying, he sent a letter back to Congressman John Conyers from Detroit, who was the chair of the committee at the time and the primary sponsor of the legislation. And he said, I appreciate that all you want to do at this point, all we were asking for, was the collection of the data. I appreciate that you want to do that, but we don't believe that our guys should have to participate in unnecessary sociological experiments.
Huh.
That was their opposition. So look, so the fight's on. We know where the line is. We're going to have to make sure that we're right up to that line. We're going to have to cross it. We have to cross it in a smart way. So what you're talking about is what families can do is make sure they stand behind their person, even though they're dead, and continue to address concerns, because what they did was wrong. It was absolutely wrong. I'm still haunted by that image. At the time, Trayvon Martin was killed by somebody that wanted to be a police officer. My oldest son was 17 years old, and I cried at my desk because what I saw happening in that particular case can happen to any young man, any place. But nonetheless, even he got off, and he wasn't actually a police officer. He's the one that wanted to be a police officer. Look at those issues and what we have to see what's most dangerous to us, understanding the real problems we have with law enforcement and the utilization of power in the United States of America. And let me also say this. The conversation we have about racism includes a component of power. Racism, best definition I've ever heard, is racial prejudice plus power. There's that racial prejudice. They're sitting on a bench. If they have the power, that's why we see so many African-American men and women in prison today. As you know, our jails and prisons have about 2 million people, about 2.2 million people, as a matter of fact, between all the jails and prisons across the country. But those 40% are African-American, and we only make 12.5% of the population. If we look at the data, we also see that maybe prison isn't the right idea, because half of those, a little bit over half of those in our prisons today are there for nonviolent, mostly drug-related offenses. They don't need a jail cell. They need a hospital bed. We need to talk about issues in those terms as well. And I appreciate why people say they want to defund the police. Let me say, what we need is to totally restructure the police process. And we have to talk about it in two terms. I appreciate what the previous speaker was talking about in our jails and the issue around prison reform. Yes, we need prison reform, but you can't talk about prison reform seriously without sentencing reform as well. So it's a mandatory minimum sentences to put people in prison and keep them there for too long. And it's another tool that was done and strongly opposed by the Congressional Black Caucus that we also utilize, not only keep them in prison for a very long time, long science. We have something called truth in sentencing. Truth in sentencing says that we don't provide the supplements to local prisons and jails unless they commit to making sure that regardless of how somebody ended up in that prison cell, they're going to have to spend at least 80% of that sentence there before they can be let out. And if they don't agree to that, we're not going to send you the federal government matching funds. Those are the issues we're confronting now. So 2 issues. One, we have to talk about sentencing reform. We have to talk about criminal justice reform all across the board. The last time we've had a serious assessment and interpretation of our criminal justice system was the 1960s under Lyndon Johnson. It's time for us to do it again. The system's convoluted, and racial and ethnic minorities and Black women too are taking a big hit for these issues. And we're watching executions take place on our TV screens.
Absolutely. Wow. Very, very well put. So I want to shift the conversation a bit to talk about a related issue, mass incarceration, which we touched on, which we went into a lot of detail on with Huwe. And one of the things that exists is there's a lot of advice. There's a lot of videos out there about how to deal with the police. And frankly, all of them say, don't say anything. Don't talk to the police. Don't try to defend yourself. Don't. And there's actually one video, we'll share it in the post-event email called Shut the F Up Friday. And it was a hilarious video by these 2 lawyers basically saying, shut the F up. Just don't say anything. And they tell you exactly what to say, what not to say. And it's a beautiful 2-minute video. And so, you know, there's a lot of this advice going on. But one of the things that makes me, frankly, a little uncomfortable with that advice is it kind of puts the onus on the victim. You know, like it makes it my job to protect myself when I don't feel like I should need protecting. And so I'm wondering, when you think about these police issues on a systemic level, what can be done in terms of police reform once it gets to interrogation and actually being a part of the prison system?
Well, let me begin by saying the point you're raising about what happens at the front end is crucially important. And I felt the same way when I started looking at how the law was set, how the procedures move forward when someone is pulled over. That they seem, when I talk to police officers and otherwise, they seem to say that how that situation goes is really up to how much we're willing to comply, even as much as we see what's going on as being racist in and of itself. We are outraged that someone would pull us over the way that they did for no good reason. It's no surprise as you think about the entire concept of racial profiling, in which even the Justice Department to this day collects that data. And I can talk more about that at some point if it's helpful. But in those cases, I think what we're going to have to think a lot more about, number one, what we see as being acceptable, because the point you're making is right. So let me say two things as we move through this process. Number one, we want to keep you alive. And so keeping quiet, thinking about it as you go. But what I told my sons, I have 3 sons, and I had to tell each of them in that talk, and we talk about that talk all the time and whatnot as well. If you're pulled over by a police officer, stop for any good reason, you need to stop. Comply. But here's what you need to do. You need to commit to memory the nameplate on that policeman's shirt, and if there is no nameplate, commit that. You need to commit to memory the badge number of that police officer, and if you can't see the badge, you need to commit that to memory as well. Give them everything they want and talking about the issue and whatnot. I know it's going to be outrageous, but here's what you're doing. You're preparing the case that we're going to bring against that police officer as soon as you get home. Because as soon as you get home and tell me what happened, leave it to your daddy. We're going to get the hell out of him. So doing what you did was important, but along with that is another commitment. We got to change the law. We got to change the policy. So in essence, so they can be held accountable to those issues as well. Thank God for video. I appreciate what that brings to the equation. We support body cams as well. We have to talk more about the legal procedures for maintaining the data that's collected, how it can be used, who can have access to it, and other things along those lines to actually protect your security, your privacy, and other issues along those lines. Stay on top of that as well. But we also want to make sure that as we're moving forward, we actually change it. No one should have to go through that. When we're going through that, we are humiliated in many ways. I've been taken off to jail. I know what it's like, sitting in the back of that car with my hands chained behind my back and everything else. But let me say this, when it was all over and done, I'd been convicted of 1 crime in my life, but I've been to jail several times. It's something that we're going to have to continue to deal with. And I thank God that you have kind of folks that are listening to this today that represent various races and ethnicities and backgrounds. That's important. It's important we share those things and stand up together and say, look, our laws cannot continue to carry us this way. I'll tell you one quick story you might find fascinating as well. Mandatory minimum sentences are a huge deal. We opposed them from the time that they were actually introduced in the 1990s as part of the comprehensive drug reform bills, as they called them. We said, look, you do mandatory minimums and people are going to go to jail and stay for a long time for no good reason. We spent a lot of time determining who gets to sit on that bench. We actually look at their background, their experiences, the things they've done and everything else, and all of that is calculated before we ratify you as a judge in the federal courts. As we're thinking in those terms, because that arduous process, we're hoping that these are people that have vast judgment to interpret the law and apply them without the artificial restrictions like mandatory minimums and other issues along those lines. Again, as I say, we can't talk seriously about prison reform unless part of that conversation is sentencing reform as well. With all that being said, there's a way we can have this fight. Let's talk about that, and let's talk about restoring power to the people. I know it sounds like a good catchphrase, but we believe that communities should have more oversight and power over the police officers that serve their communities. Police accountability review boards need a 10-point litmus is what the NAACP advocates for. These review boards must have the power to summon a police officer before them if it's reported they've done something wrong. It should have subpoena power to be able to get the evidence that was part of the case in which the police officer is accused of doing something wrong. They should have the resources to be able to have their own investigators go out and take a look at what's happening. They should be able to shut down an internal affairs investigation and have all the data and evidence and otherwise turned over to them as they assess what this police officer has done, if they've done something wrong. They should also keep a list of those police officers that have misbehaved before. We learned in George Floyd's case and so many other cases across the country, it's the police officers that do these things. This was not their first time.
It was a pattern. There
is a pattern.
Yeah.
And as we say here in Washington, within the Justice Department, there are two areas in which the Justice Department has jurisdiction over police officers. One is what's called a 14141, and that is more of a criminal investigation. The other is called a pattern and practice. When you see police officers putting people in the chokehold and African Americans dying, and the Los Angeles government saying, because when their police officers are guilty of that, it's not that our police officers did anything wrong. It's that African Americans have weirdly constructed necks. Let that soak in for a minute. They actually had the audacity to say that quite publicly. That was like in New Jersey, when we found that there was so much racial profiling going on our highways and byways. We raised the issue. The federal government intercepted as we needed them to intercede, and actually put them in receivership and said they're going to have to actually do a study. We want to see how often the police officers get it right and how often they get it wrong. So they started recording cars, and they had a group of people look at the recordings to tell what the race of the person was. Don't forget, racial profiling is an issue of perception by an individual police officer as they come after you. They looked at the data, and the data showed that African Americans were much more likely to get stopped than anybody else, with Latinos coming in second. When the governor of New Jersey at the time was presented with that evidence, standing right next to the director of the state law enforcement agency, said, well, it's not that our police officers are biased. The African Americans drive faster. Again, African Americans only make up 12.5% of the population, and disproportionately fewer of those that are driving cars and whatnot, mostly because we're disproportionately poor and afford cars. So with all that in mind, let's talk about, number one, we got to change the policy. We've got to change the law. The George Floyd bill that passed the House of Representatives, something began that process very well. If you want to find out who supported it and who didn't, if for those of you, all of you from different places, I believe, across the country, see how your member of Congress did in the House of Representatives. What you'll see is that some of them that have probably patted you on the back, thanked you for voting for them last time, and asked you to vote for them this time and whatnot, was the same folks that voted against this measure. It was one of the most common sense measures that's ever become before the Congress. I do want to thank people like Nancy Pelosi, though she don't as much look like me, very well for me. And I'm very grateful for that.
Absolutely.
We're on our way over to the Senate, and we already have to leave this point with you on the Senate side of this fight. Mitch McConnell said that bill was dead on arrival. Mitch McConnell, who's the majority leader in the Senate, has control over which bills will come to the floor. The bill has passed the House. There should be no exception for the reason to come to the floor of the Senate, except the majority leader of the Senate says, we ain't having it. Let me also say that our good friends Cory Booker from New Jersey and Kamala Harris from California, with both exceptional records prior to coming to the U.S. Senate, introduced a companion legislation in the Senate and are there to help us have that fight. We've got to make sure the rest of those senators, a third of which are up for re-election, by the way, the right thing as we move into the process.
Absolutely. So earlier, you defined racism for us, which was a very powerful definition. I haven't heard that definition before. I'm wondering, can you define systemic racism for us?
Oh, sure. I would define systemic racism as we think about I'll use the term again, the systems of programs throughout our country, whether it is our banking system, our criminal justice system, our education system, are devised in a way in which they are discriminatory. In some cases, you don't see it on the surface because it applies to everyone the same way. But when you look at the differences, the circumstances that we all come to the table, and hopefully we're all seeking to come to the table, we see that very well it affects us differently. If you say that I pulled you over because you look suspicious, that is, the police officer is now using his or her power. And they're bringing with that a prejudice in a law enforcement system that is set up to allow him or her the flexibility to actually even arrest you because you look suspicious. They can hold you, as you know, for even in most places up to 48 hours without any charges being brought. Again, the system is working in a unique way for us. Let me give you one more example of the criminal justice system. Our criminal justice system in most states, even during the time that the time you've been arrested and the time you go before a judge, you can actually pay a cash bail, to be free. But if you look at the data and realize who has the resources to afford cash bail, you'll see that disproportionately African Americans are underpaid, jobless. As a matter of fact, Trump talks about the unemployment rate in the country prior to coronavirus. And what he said was it's the lowest ever in history. But let me say, we also want to dissect that too. The answer is he was right. It was the lowest in history since we've been collecting the data. And we've been collecting that data for about 80 of all the years this place has been a country. What we did say is, disproportionately, however, it's less than 3% for white Americans, but an educated guess, if you want to know what the unemployment is for African Americans, it's more than double the overall national average, and even more than that for white Americans themselves. It's about the data. It's about the data.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So when we talk about systemic racism and, us dismantling that system, given the fact that it is so pervasive and it's a part of every part of our lives, it's a part of the justice system, it's a part of the workforce, it's a part of housing, it just feels like it's everywhere, right? It's absolutely everywhere. And I'm wondering, when it comes to us as individuals, those of us who are not senators or not politicians or not the ones writing the legislation, where do we fit into that? If we said, I want to go fight systemic racism today, what can we do?
Well, look, whatever area that you're studying or working to master, if it's economics, we know that cash plays a big role. So as we're doing the analysis, we have to do a couple of things. Number one is, as we're deciding who to vote for, we're a federalist society, so we elect people to represent our values as they vote in our city councils, state legislatures, or here in the federal government, and so forth. With all that in mind, we want to make sure that there are those people that we're voting for, folks that represent our values. That's what this democracy is really supposed to be all about. It's being able to elect people to represent our values. That's what Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act is all about, making sure we can elect people that represent our values. So if you're talking about those issues, you want to start there. Secondly, we want to make sure that every law that addresses every issue also includes data collection. We talk about home ownership, data collection. We're talking about CRA, that is the evaluation that we put on banks every year, that they have to explain why they're doing things that actually address the real issues of people that live in their community. We want the data collected, and we want them accountable at the front end and accountable at the back end as well. In essence, if you want to get that contract again, let me see your data. How many African Americans, Hispanic, Native Americans, Asian Americans have you given mortgages to? And as we further analyze that, how many of them got the sweetheart deal of 3% or less on that mortgage note and a fixed rate so they could afford it? Again, as we talk about economics, we know that there's a real difference between riches, that is how much money you have, and wealth. It creates more money. The number one source of wealth in the United States of America is home ownership. If you're blocked from getting home ownership, which is something we've seen going on for generations now, my parents went to buy their first house, nobody would give them a mortgage because no insurance company would insure them in the zip code that we lived in. The mortgage company wants to make sure they get their money. In other words, we were blocking African Americans getting wealth. As we look at the data, and we talk about the economic side, and we can talk about some of the other sides as well, including education and the like. So we're looking at the economic issues. We realize that African Americans are being paid less money for doing the same jobs. Mm-hmm. And those that don't even want to raise the minimum wage. Mm-hmm. As we think about those issues, we also think about how those resources affect all of us. We have no problems spending $25,000 a year to keep somebody in the jail cell. But if we gave students $25,000 a year, there'd be very few students, very few African Americans at all that would not be able to pay that tuition and get that great education. Mm-hmm. Talk about those issues. And let's not forget to compare us to other countries as well. This is not pie in the sky. It's a quick story. We have a unit in Heidelberg, Germany, on a military base. They asked me to come and give a Dr. King speech a few years ago, and I was excited about going over to see how the NAACP functions in Europe. I got there, and they introduced me to a young woman, African-American from California, who was working on her PhD in Heidelberg, Germany, one of the finest universities actually in the world. And I asked, how's a sister like you end up in Heidelberg? Are you studying German culture, history? She said, no. I'm working on my PhD in world political science. I said, oh. I said, well, why Heidelberg? She said, because I pay no tuition here. All I have to do is raise enough money to pay for my room and board and whatnot, and I'm in great shape. She's working on Capitol Hill now for Congresswoman Gwen Moore from Wisconsin, doing an extraordinary job, but you know what? Everybody's got to call her doctor. I love that approach, and we have to be very thoughtful about our values as well, because I think most people on this Zoom would love to see, I guess it's Zoom, would love to be able to know they could walk in and get their college education by putting the work in to getting the degree, rather than trying to find somebody that can pay for the tuition.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
It's about our values.
Absolutely. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the role of corporations in dismantling systemic racism and in the fight for anti-racism. And I want to specifically talk about Facebook. One of the big issues that we have been talking about and been fighting is the spread of hate speech, which is absolutely awful. And Facebook has been notorious over the years. They have not been, great on privacy. They have not been great at moderating content, and definitely have been criticized for not prioritizing the safety of their communities. And as a result, there's been an incredible initiative to boycott Facebook. And there have been over 90 advertisers, including Unilever, including Coca-Cola and Verizon, who've all said that for the month of July, we are not going to advertise, we're not going to spend our dollars. And Facebook stock dropped as a result of it. And they were forced to basically respond and to say, we're going to implement these new policies, these new guidelines, and they were forced to act and really do something about it. And so I'm wondering, when you think about that example, you think about other corporations that have been pressured into making those changes, are those changes enough? Should we, in the case of Facebook, should we still be boycotting? Have they done enough for the fight towards anti-racism?
Let me say, as we talk about Facebook, I'll put us into kind of two lanes. One is, the question is, have they done enough? And the short answer is no. Quite frankly, if you look at what's going on, what they decided is the easiest way out to be able to maintain or maximize their profits. It's all about profits. You can't talk about capitalism without talking about profit. By maximizing their profits, what they said is, we'll take hands off. Hands off meaning we won't make any decisions at all. Perhaps we'll put up a little warning saying the information on Facebook may or may not be true, and we certainly don't stand behind it. All they're doing is clearing themselves from liability, leaving us all to be victimized by such a huge tool of misinformation that's created all kind of problems for us. So it's amazing how we think about that in the way that Facebook was utilized in the last election, but not just there. Facebook's been utilized by a series of other schemes as well. But when it comes time to talk about accountability, even though they made all the money, they got paid for everything they did. They're saying we have nothing to do with it. So much more needs to be done. Whether the tool is boycott, we have to make those decisions every step of the way, whether it's something else. But in any which case, I do think we have to continue to expose Facebook for what they're doing, continue to show American people what's going on. And you see people make their own decisions about how they want to spend their resources. And it's a reliable source that they should think about it all. And perhaps there's a better way to go than to spend any time messing around with Facebook with information that may or may not be accurate.
And there's been, tons of protest advocacy and, just a huge ruckus trying to convince Facebook to do better over the years, even before Black Lives Matter happened. And it feels like the only way to get them to respond is by hitting their wallet, right? Just talking to them in the language of money. So I'm curious, when you think about the work of the NAACP, and you've been thinking about the way you have worked with corporations, maybe pressured corporations, is it really just about money, or, are there other ways that we can get them to do the right thing?
Well, I think that sadly and unfortunately, for most of them, it's going to come down to profit. Are you hitting me in the belt? If they're continuing to make profit, they're not going to change the way they do business. They're not. So we're going to have to make sure that that happens. And the best way is, if not Facebook, then what? There are other options out there, and who knows? We got some extremely gifted, sharp, smart brothers and sisters that can make some decisions and actually create something, I would argue, to be much better. And along with that will come some values that we celebrate, that reflect the concerns of our communities, values that would not allow Russia to be able to utilize its power and its programmers, to utilize a program like Facebook to be able to bring so many things that were not true to the U.S. Surfaces and whatnot, allowing, quite frankly, the man to get into the White House that did, even though the woman that was running against him had a great first name, by the way. But the woman that was running against him still ended up with 3 million more votes than he did. But he played this other game anyway. So bottom line is that there are better ways. Exposing Facebook, quite frankly, what you're exposing is a program that is inaccurate. Who wants to spend time with inaccuracies and try to figure out what's true and what's not true? Well, they clearly don't do it for themselves. So in essence, there's a better way. We see people like Verizon stepping up as they did. They've helped us not only on the Facebook issue, but they've also helped us on issues like prison phone rates. They don't do prisons because prisons want to charge too much money. They want too much of the profit going back to them, when prisoners, who are some of the poorest people on the planet, end up wanting to speak to their folks back home. And when we look again at the data, we see that those that maintain the closest connection with their folks and friends back in their home areas and whatnot are those most likely to get out, least likely to ever come back, directly into the recidivism rate. There's more we can do. There's more we can do.
Absolutely. So a lot of corporations have responded to Black Lives Movement by donating money. I think Apple donated $100 million. I think that was the highest donation that I came across, that I saw. And I think this is wonderful. I think it's great to dedicate dollars to a lot, NAACP being one of them, ACLU, bail funds, a lot of these organizations who are doing the work on the ground that are trying to change the systems, but they've also come under fire for not looking inward. And I think this question really pertains to people on this call, the business leaders we have on this call, because they haven't changed how people are getting mentored in their organizations. They haven't taken a look at their own leadership and seen that they have no Black people in powerful positions, and there are no people moving up the career ladder who represent all of America and who represent the Black community. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts were on that. Is it fair to ask companies to kind of clean up their own house first?
I wouldn't say first, but they need to clean them up. They make the contributions and the donations, start doing the right thing, period. They should have been giving resources to community-based organizations, the organizations focusing on providing great services in all our neighborhoods, recognizing what's going on, programs and otherwise. They should have been doing that all along, so they should be doing it. The fact that they started doing does not get them off the hook in addressing issues like, as you were saying, is there diversity in your C-suites? Was the diversity in your corporation from the top all the way down? How many racial and ethnic minority-owned small businesses are you contracting with? What about Black vendors? As you're thinking about all those issues, what about our colleges and universities that are feeding the greatest minds in our country and our world into you, so you have the kind of workforce that you need to be effective and successful? All those things should be part of the scenario, and that's why one of the things that we do on a regular basis is make sure we do an assessment of the corporations as well. We do corporate scorecards. We want to see how you're doing, and we want to see how your board looks too. You know, in most of these large corporations, board members get about $60,000 a year and help steer those corporations as well. I know folks that have retired from corporate America that are sitting on 3 and 4 boards. They're making more money now than they were when they worked for the corporation they retired from.
Wow.
So all that's to say, we want to see those black faces up in there too.
Mm-hmm.
Those black faces, we want to see the internship programs, bringing them in to be able to train them on how to do these things. Look, I got into a real interesting conversation with a friend of mine that works for Gulf Oil. Now, you know, I appreciate that dealing with oil and whatnot is something we want to transition to and whatnot, and hopefully we'll continue to work in that direction. Fossil fuels are destroying the atmosphere and the environment and a little bit of everything else. We've got to talk about those issues too. But what he loves saying is, say, Brother Shelton, I see what you're saying about, you know, us changing the way we do business in terms of fossil fuels. But let me ask you about those environmentally friendly energy companies. Are they paying a sister from Spelman who's trying to finish her undergraduate degree? Are they paying her $70,000 a summer to come and work with them and learn how to do business with our corporation? Are they paying her that money with a guarantee that when she comes out, we're going to double that and pay her $140,000 a year to begin with our corporation and move her way up? Are they going to do that for her? And I said, brother, I don't know, I'm glad you're doing it, but that's no excuse. You got to clean up our environment too. Mm-hmm. But you hear the bottom line. We've got to be able to make sure that everyone comes through the way they're supposed to, the way we want to hold them accountable to. If you want my money, you've got to provide those services in my community, in my country, and in my world. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So we do need to hold them accountable every step of the way. We need to make sure that they're providing those services. We've got to do the accounting. We got to do the math. In order to manage these problems, we have to first measure.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. One of the responses that I've seen to companies, organizations who have racism and discrimination within their corporations is that the leadership gets fired or resigns. One example of that is a woman named Audrey Gelman, who's the founder of The Wing, which is this very hot up-and-coming, they're just 3 years old, but they've made quite a splash in creating co-working spaces for women. And they are seen as being very progressive and being, you know, just, and they came out right after the 2016 election results. So it was really just, you know, prime time for women to, you know, take leadership positions, and really people were fighting for women at that point. And so they had some criticism, and some things came to light about how they were treating their Black and brown employees. And as a result, I don't know if she got fired or if she resigned, but either way, the founder there is no longer the CEO. She's gone. And for me, on the one hand, I understand the need to change the system at the top. You know, I completely believe in top-down culture, and that the rest of the organization is usually built off the image of the people who are in power. But on the other hand, it was disappointing to not see an opportunity for leadership to fix it. You know, this woman who was, I mean, she had a cover, I think it was on Inc. magazine, where she was like 8 months pregnant. You know, it was this beautiful image of this powerful woman CEO who was a mom, you know what I mean? And so I said to myself, it would have been such a message, such a powerful message to have her turn her company around and become this place that was very supportive of Black people. And so I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on that? Is it the right thing to do to just remove leadership? Is it better for them to be given an opportunity to fix it? What are your thoughts on that?
They've got to change the policy. What you just demonstrated is something we've seen happen in many, many cases, where a personality ends up carrying the solutions. But if that personality is not available, then they feel like they've gotten off the hook. If you've got a personality that's in there doing the right thing, let part of that right thing being changing the policy, changing their approach, and creating the program, so we can hold them accountable beyond that individual. But it is the actions of the corporation that we're speaking about in the first place. So let's begin down that road. So let's make sure that the programs are in place. If they start changing those programs, then we go after them again. If it's a person, what you're trying to do is find your next savior. Mm-hmm. We need another savior. We need to change the policies and see how these programs work and make sure that they work for us and our people as well. We got to do the math. In order to manage these problems, we've got to measure.
Mm-hmm. So we have one more question for you. And then after that, we're going to go to Q&A. So if you have some questions for Hilary, get those ready, raise your hand, and I will call on you. So the last question I have for you is, we've talked about a lot of different topics in this conversation. We talked about reform and defunding and corporations and mass incarceration. I want to know if there's one thing that you'd like each of us to take away from this conversation, for us to take away into our own lives, our own communities, our own places of work. What would that one thing be?
It would be that it's really on us. Regardless of what we're studying, regardless of what we see ourselves doing, whether we're in engineering or science, whether we're in business or music, regardless of what we're doing, we have a responsibility and an accountability as we think about issues of democracy. If this is going to be a democracy, and we brag about that stuff throughout the world and whatnot, let me first say we're not the best at it. Say we are, but that's an ego problem. If you look at other countries, and we should look at what other countries are doing and whatnot, it's looking for the best ideas, let's focus there. So determine what you think is right and wrong. Quite frankly, your heart will drive you in the right direction. If somebody's being treated wrongly, regardless of what they look like, race, gender, ethnicity, point of national origin, or whatever the case might very well be, we have to make sure that everybody gets treated the same way. Otherwise, we leave ourselves vulnerable. I'll never forget a young man in West Virginia, 27 years old, very small, petite guy, walking home past a house that was being renovated. African-American who happened to be gay. These 5 white guys decided to drag him into that house that was being renovated and basically beat him to death. They drug him outside, threw him in the back car. The guy was so small, you could put him behind the back seat in the window area. Do you know what I'm talking about? The entire time, he was muttering because he could barely speak at all as he bled and suffered from all the damage that had been done to him. Will you please take me home? I want my mother. Can you imagine that? They took him out to the middle of the road in a deserted highway, threw his body out on the side of the road, and drove that car back and forward across his body.
Wow.
The issue on the table was, is this a hate crime? Black man, white perpetrators, and the white perpetrator said, no, we didn't beat him up because he was black. We beat him up because we thought he was gay. In other words, the gay community, and still in West Virginia, the gay community was held vulnerable because there are real problems with the fairness of our policies. It may not look like it affects us directly, but if it affects anyone, quite frankly, it affects all of us. So we got to decide what's right. And quite frankly, that's why I also give the Black Lives Matter movement such respect, seeing the diversity of those that have come out to work with issues to address these concerns. Thereby, by the grace of God, go I. Make sure that you are fully prepared to have this fight with us. It doesn't mean you have to don a uniform, but you do need a voter registration card. It means you have to be prepared and knowledgeable about all the issues so that you can bring those issues to bear and make sure when those Congress people come to talk to you, members of the city council, state legislature, and otherwise, they know that I'm going to hold you accountable. The NAACP or some other organization I'm working with is an organization that sends to me every time you vote your voting record. We do that, We do a report card at the end of each congressional year. Congress lasts 2 years. We do a midterm report card at the end of the first year and a final report card at the end of the second year, telling you how your member of Congress voted on all those civil rights issues that are truly important and priority. NAACP and the values that we hold in the areas of civil rights. Get that voter registration card, watch the news, follow somebody you know is going to make sure you get the truth, because we know that's one place I do believe our president is right. There's a lot of news that is simply not true. I appreciate that. But as they say, a stopped clock is right twice a day. So he was right on that one. So let's be prepared. Let's be educated on the issues. Let's be very clear about what's important in our communities. And let's get to know the diversity of those out there. We know that though we're African Americans and we have an extraordinarily unique set of challenges and problems, our friends in the Latino community have a different uniquely set of problems and whatnot they have to deal with. Our friends in the Asian community, our friends in other communities as well. But I've learned something else too. There's something called a convergence in interest. Regardless of who you talk to, their race, ethnicity, the point in which they came to the shores of the United States, or whether they were here the entire time, as to think about our friends from the Native American communities. We may be different in those ways, but if you ask all of the same question about what do you want, you'll get answers to speak to. I want every opportunity to exercise the skills that I've gotten in a way that will maximize my profits so I can have a good home life. So I can buy a home, condominium, whatever the case might be. I can educate my children and put food on the tables. So I can do all these things that I think are very, very important to me. No matter who you talk to, they're going to respond to that same question the same way, regardless of the color of their skin, their point of national origin, their gender, sexual orientation, whatever the case might be. Make friends and build coalition on issues that help make our country live up to its promise of equal opportunity and equal protection for everybody.
Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. All right, let's see if we have some questions. So just as a reminder to raise your hand, you can go to participants, click on that, and you should be able to see a little hand icon and you can raise it there. So we'll give the audience a minute or two to come up with some questions. All right, I see Jonathan Hammond. We'll unmute you and you can ask your question. All right, go ahead, Jonathan.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Hilary.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Just a lot of learning for sure. And today I actually stumbled upon something called data journalism. I'm currently teaching myself how to code, how to program, and I was wondering if there were any resources you would recommend in terms of like data sets, because I am trying to learn how to sort of marry the two interests in terms of making change in this world and, you know, making something out of data that, you know, would make the difference, but people really don't understand if, you know what I'm saying, in terms of.
Gotcha. No, and that's important. Give a lot of credit to Barack Obama for being so singularly focused in many areas of coding and other issues of being able to have access to that data along those lines. With that, most of the tech companies also stepped forward as well as the White House really pushed in that area to make sure resources were available, scholarships were there. Most of the scholarships, as a matter of fact, whether you go to Thurgood Marshall Fund, whether you go to the United Negro College Fund or a few other places and whatnot, we'll have resources for those who want to study in that area. So I would recommend you go in that direction. Finally, NAACP also has some scholarships, not as many as UNCF, excuse me, and not as many as the Thurgood Marshall Foundation, but we do have resources along those lines. Go to our website at NAACP.org, take advantage of that. Go to the United Negro College Fund's website, but don't limit yourself to African American organizations. I think we do a great job too. Go after all the money that's out there. Again, I have a niece that got money from Google when they were doing the right thing. And she was able to, she actually ended up switching her career direction from engineering to coding and computer data. So in other words, there was simply more money available along those lines. You shouldn't have too much trouble finding resources to provide scholarship and other support along those lines too. I was thinking that direction.
Thank you.
Sure, you're quite welcome.
Wonderful. Let's see if we can get maybe one or two questions more.
That might be it, Mr. Ron. I'll go ahead and cheat and jump in.
Go for it.
As a facilitator, I shouldn't be.
Otherwise.
But Hilary, I'm so glad that you shared everything with us, and I'm glad that you mentioned in particular the issue around some of the police unions. They've spent millions of dollars at this point to preserve the status quo, when many of the folks on this line are curious, if not already convinced, that we need to make changes. So how do we bring more people into that fight? How do we drag more people in to kind of change that balance against those police unions that are dead set against preserving the status quo?
Tell the story, give the witness, make sure they know exactly what's going on, understanding the problem, but then help them understand their role in solving the problem. Dr. King oftentimes talked about something he called the paralysis of analysis. That is, you hear brothers and sisters on the street all the time talking about what went wrong, how bad it was. They provide this solution in their analysis and things along those lines. I appreciate them, but what not doing is taking that next step. That next step is beginning to utilize those resources and energy to solve the problem itself. So in essence, we want to understand it well and understand we all have a role in addressing that problem. We're quietly supporting, and hopefully we won't be too quiet about any of these things, or whether we're utilizing the outrage that we feel and seeing the direction and making the change is not in breaking a storefront window, but in changing the law and breaking the chains that are too often utilized to hold us down while we're trying to actually fix the problem. Don't be skirted. By that I mean, don't be pulled over into the wrong direction. One of the things we're seeing, even with the demonstrations that are very important, shining that bright light the demonstrations do on the problem is absolutely crucial. But if you're holding a demonstration and someone else is coming in and actually violently involving themselves in destroying property, the story won't be told about the problem that you're trying to bring the attention to. The story will be told about the property that was damaged and those awful folks that were participating in that demonstration. They were there to burn, loot, and otherwise. What we really want to do is change the law.
Wonderful. All right, any final questions for Hilary before we wrap up for the evening? Give you guys another minute. Okay, I'll take that as a no. Well, thank you so much, Hilary, for being with us and sharing your years of experience and your years of, fighting for justice and equality. It was absolutely an honor to have you here. So thank you for spending your evening with us. We really appreciate it.
Oh, sis, it's a real honor and a privilege. Now, I know sometimes people think about these things a little bit later, so I'll just ask you to do this. If you want to ask me other questions, I hope you'll do one of two things. One is we have a website at the NAACP, an email address at Washington Bureau, NAACPnet.org. Washington Bureau at NAACPnet.org. That's my office. In essence, you can get any questions you want to me, and I'll reach back out to you either through the internet or if you give me your phone number, I'll call you.
Wonderful. And we'll include that email address in our post-event email. So thank you so much for that.
It's a million now.
Yeah. So before we wrap, I also want to give a shout out. You heard from Andrea Massam. She's worked a ton on this event and in the series. And I also want to give a shout out to Barry Wise, who just asked our final question. He's loaning us our Zoom and has been absolutely instrumental in getting this series off the ground. So thank you to my co-organizers. Now, before we part for the evening, I have two things to ask of you. The first is to please fill out our post-event survey. We're going to send that out to everyone who's registered. And that survey really helps us out. It helps us figure out what we did right, what we could have done better, and helps us produce even more powerful and impactful events to you in the future. So please take some time, just a few minutes, to give us your honest feedback and let us know how this event went for you. The other thing is to please think about your role as a leader in your community, whether it's in your neighborhood, just within your family, within your place of work, and think about one thing you can do to uplift and support the Black members of your community. I'm sure we can all take one little step towards anti-racism. So I ask you to think about that, reflect on that, and try to do that one small thing in the next coming 2 weeks. We've got our next event happening on July 28th, so we'd love to have you back. We have some excellent speakers continuing the conversation on systemic racism and what we can do to fight it. So please come out to that, and we'll have a link to registration in our post-event email. And that's all we got. Thank you again for spending your evening with us. We hope you found this event educational and inspiring and empowering and insightful, and we hope to see you again at our next event. And actually, before we leave, can we all take a moment, unmute, and just give a little round of applause to Hilary and Huwe? Can we all do that for a second? I'm gonna unmute everyone. All right, can we do a little round of applause? Everyone unmuted? Unmute all. Okay, there we go. Thank you very much. All right, wonderful. All right, well, everyone, have a good evening.
You too, thank you.
Thank you.